Darnell Carter had always believed that hard work would speak louder than anything else in the corporate world, especially in the sleek glass towers of Morrison and Hawley Enterprises in downtown Chicago, where every corner smelled like ambition and silent competition. He had joined the company 6 years ago as a junior analyst and slowly built his reputation through long nights, impossible deadlines, and solving problems that others often ignored. Yet despite his consistent performance, he had always felt a strange, invisible wall between him and the higher management. A wall he could not fully prove but could always sense in the way conversations stopped when he entered rooms or how his ideas were acknowledged but rarely celebrated. Still, he never allowed frustration to control him because he believed results would eventually break every barrier. Over time, Darnell became known internally as the Fixer because whenever a project was close to collapse, his name would quietly appear in emails asking for help. He never complained, he just fixed things, from failed marketing analytics to broken client pipelines. He handled them all with precision. But when it came to promotions, he noticed a pattern. People with less experience were often moved ahead while he was told to wait for the right time, a phrase that slowly started to lose meaning for him. One Monday morning, the company announced a new executive role, Senior Strategy Director, a position that would shape the entire future of the department. Darnell had already led most of the projects that defined the department's success over the last year, so naturally he believed this time things might finally change. He didn't boast or tell anyone. He simply updated his portfolio and waited. But as the selection process began, something felt off. Meetings were held without him, decision drafts were circulated in smaller groups, and whenever he asked questions, he was told that final discussions are still ongoing. Meanwhile, he continued working on a major client restructuring plan that was critical for the company's biggest account. The office environment during that week felt heavier than usual. Small conversations would stop when he walked past, and he began noticing that certain executives avoided direct eye contact, especially when the promotion topic came up in the cafeteria or elevators. Then came the moment that shifted everything. An emergency executive meeting was held regarding the very project Darnell had designed from scratch. He was not invited, not even as a consultant. He only found out because a junior colleague accidentally mentioned it while passing by his desk. At first, he thought it was a mistake, so he calmly approached his manager, who avoided the question and said it was a high-level strategic alignment meeting. Darnell nodded, but something inside him tightened. Instead of reacting emotionally, he decided to focus on facts. He accessed the shared system to review updates, but he found something unusual. Several of his original strategy notes had been modified and re-uploaded under another senior executive's name. Not fully stolen, but subtly rebranded, enough to shift credit away from him. He didn't accuse anyone immediately. He simply kept observing. 2 days later, the promotion shortlist was released internally, and his name was missing. The person selected was someone who had joined only 18 months earlier, with significantly fewer project contributions. Yet, the announcement praised fresh leadership vision and strategic creativity. Darnell read the email 3 times without saying a word, not because he was shocked, but because he had expected disappointment before, and this felt familiar in a painful way. That evening he stayed late in the office, long after most people had left, the city lights reflecting off the glass walls around him. He reviewed everything again: project logs, email timestamps, system edits, and meeting records, and slowly a pattern started forming that was difficult to ignore. He discovered that access permissions had been changed multiple times during the week of decision-making, and most of the changes were approved by a small internal committee he had never even known existed. Still, he didn't jump to conclusions. Instead, he decided to test something. The next morning, he deliberately sent a small but critical update to the project system, a minor optimization only he would notice, and waited. Within hours, the update was removed and replaced with a different version that contained subtle errors. That was the confirmation he needed. Someone was actively altering his work before it reached final review stages. Instead of confronting the issue publicly, Darnell quietly activated backup logs from the system architecture he had helped design years ago, a feature even senior management rarely used properly. What he found next was more disturbing than the promotion decision itself. There were repeated instances where his contributions were downgraded in internal scoring systems without valid explanation. And in several cases, meetings where his attendance was required were deliberately rescheduled without notification. It wasn't one single action, it was a consistent pattern of exclusion and quiet replacement. Despite this, Darnell still came to work every day, still performed at the same level, still delivered results because he knew emotional reaction without proof would only weaken his position. But something inside him changed, not anger, but clarity. He began preparing a complete audit of his work history inside the company, carefully collecting timestamps, system logs, email threads, and project evolution records. Meanwhile, the newly promoted executives started presenting Darnell's project to clients, gaining praise and visibility. completely unaware that every version they were presenting still carried traces of Darnell's original framework. One afternoon, during a major client presentation, the system unexpectedly glitched on the main screen, revealing an older version of the strategy document, with Darnell's name clearly marked as creator. The room went silent for a few seconds before the screen was quickly switched off. That moment created tension inside the leadership team, but instead of addressing it openly, they tried to dismiss it as a technical error. Darnell realized then that the issue was no longer just about promotion, it was about recognition and truth. A week later, the company scheduled a full department review meeting with senior executives and external auditors present. This time Darnell was invited. He entered the room calmly, carrying no aggression, only a detailed folder and access logs. When his turn came to speak, he didn't argue emotionally. He simply projected a timeline of his contributions, showing exact timestamps of project creation, system modifications, and overwritten approvals. The room slowly shifted from confidence to discomfort as the evidence unfolded layer by layer. Then he revealed the access manipulation logs, showing how his visibility had been reduced during critical decision phases. Finally, he asked a simple question: why someone who built the foundation of the department's most successful project was never even considered for leadership. Silence filled the room, not because there was no answer, but because the answer was uncomfortable. The external auditors requested a pause in proceedings. What followed was a full internal investigation that uncovered multiple cases of biased evaluation practices and manipulated contribution records, not only affecting Darnell but a few other employees as well. The company leadership attempted to frame it as system misalignment, but the evidence was too structured to ignore. Within weeks, several senior decisions were reversed, and the promotion was reassessed. Darnell was finally offered the position he had originally been denied. But when the offer was placed in front of him, he didn't immediately respond. He looked around the same glass office where he had spent years proving himself, and realized something important. Recognition was valuable, but dignity mattered more than delayed approval. In the end, he accepted the role on one condition: full transparency reforms in evaluation and promotion systems. Months later, the company implemented new accountability structures, and Darnell's case became a reference point for internal fairness training. But for him, the real victory wasn't the title. It was the proof that truth, even when ignored, does not disappear. It waits for the right moment to be seen. After Darnell accepted the position with the condition of full transparency reforms, the atmosphere inside Morrison and Holley Enterprises began to shift in a way that no one could ignore. At first, it was subtle changes like new reporting structures being introduced and evaluation criteria being rewritten in shared documents that everyone had to acknowledge. But soon, it became more visible as external consultants were brought in to audit not just projects but the entire decision-making framework of the company. And for the first time in years, people started realizing that the system they thought was neutral had actually been shaped by quiet bias and unchecked influence over time. Darnell didn't celebrate loudly or try to take control of every change. Instead, he stayed focused on rebuilding trust in processes rather than personalities, because he understood that replacing individuals without fixing systems would only repeat the same cycle under a different name. In the first few weeks of his new role, he noticed resistance from some senior executives who were uncomfortable with the level of transparency now being demanded. They were used to informal decision channels and quiet approvals, but now everything had to be documented, justified, and traceable, and that created tension in meetings where previously decisions were made in private discussions. Darnell remained calm during these moments, never accusing anyone directly but always redirecting conversations back to data, structure, and accountability, which slowly shifted the culture from opinion-based authority to evidence-based leadership. Outside the boardroom, employees who had previously stayed silent began reaching out to him. Some shared similar experiences of being overlooked despite strong performance. Others described moments where their contributions were minimized or reassigned without explanation. Darnell listened to all of them without making promises he couldn't guarantee, but he made sure every concern was documented and fed into the audit process. Over time, this created a growing internal file of patterns that could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. One of the most important turning points came during a quarterly review when the company's biggest client directly questioned inconsistencies in project ownership after noticing different names attached to different versions of the same strategy documents. The client wasn't accusing anyone, but the question itself exposed the instability of internal records, and that moment forced leadership to accelerate the reform process instead of delaying it further. Darnell used that opportunity not to blame but to propose a new unified project tracking system that would permanently link contributions to original creators in real time. As the new system was rolled out, visibility across departments increased significantly, and for the first time many employees saw their work accurately reflected without alteration or silent reassignment. This change alone started improving morale, especially among junior staff who had previously felt invisible despite heavy workloads. But not everyone was comfortable with this shift. A few senior figures who thrived under the old and formal structure began to step back or leave voluntarily, realizing that the environment no longer allowed influence without accountability. Darnell's leadership style became known internally as quiet but firm. He didn't rely on authority to command respect. Instead, he relied on clarity, consistency, and fairness. And ironically, this approach earned him more genuine respect than any title alone could have given him before. Even those who initially doubted him started acknowledging that the system was functioning better under structured transparency than under personal influence. Months passed, and the company slowly stabilized under the new framework. Client trust improved, internal conflicts reduced, and project delivery became more consistent because responsibilities were clearly defined and protected. But for Darnell, the most meaningful change wasn't in performance charts or revenue reports. It was in the behavior of people who once hesitated to speak in meetings, but now contributed openly, without fear of being ignored or replaced. One evening after a long review session, Darnell stayed back alone in the office, looking out through the same glass walls that once made him feel small in comparison to the towering structure of corporate power. But now the same space felt different, not because it had changed physically, but because his understanding of it had changed completely. He realized that the real problem was never just one promotion or one decision. It was the invisible systems that decide who gets heard and who gets erased over time. He reflected on how easily silence can become normal in places where people are taught to accept delays instead of fairness, and how often talent is not missing but simply filtered out through layers of subtle exclusion. That thought stayed with him longer than any victory announcement ever could. A few weeks later, the board formally confirmed his expanded role along with a long-term mandate to oversee equity in leadership pipelines and performance evaluation systems. But what surprised many was that Darnell didn't turn it into a personal platform. Instead, he built a rotating review council that included employees from different levels of the organization, ensuring that decisions were not concentrated in one group but shared across perspectives. Over time, Morrison and Holly Enterprises became a case study in corporate restructuring, not because it was perfect, but because it openly acknowledged its flaws and actively worked to correct them. And within that transformation, Darnell's name became associated not with conflict, but with repair and reform. In the end, what remained most powerful about his journey was not the moment he was denied or the moment he was finally promoted, but the quiet consistency he maintained through both injustice and recognition, showing that real change doesn't always come from confrontation alone, but from building systems strong enough that fairness is no longer optional, it is automatic.